Well, we have a number of items in the collection that tell stories related to the Great War. In 2014 we did quite a big exhibition commemorating the beginning of the outbreak of the war, in which we looked at what people in Coventry had contributed both on the home front and on active service. So we told lots of different stories about individuals in Coventry and showed exhibits relating to the Second World War, so things like uniforms from people who were on active service, medals, that kind of thing, and then things that were made in Coventry to support the war effort during the war, so aeroplane engines, shells, that sort of thing. Now that was just a temporary exhibition, so that is now long gone, and now as we come into 2018 and the commemorations of the end of the war, we're marking this by having a display of artworks on the theme of the First World War, which is in our main art gallery. So that includes works by artists who were working at the time of the war, people like William Roberts and William Orpen, both quite well-known artists who were working around the time of the First World War. But also contemporary pieces by artists who are working today, who are choosing to use their work to reflect particular aspects of the war. So, for example, we have two photographs by Chloe Dew Matthews. She is an artist who became interested in those soldiers who were executed by firing squad by their own side for allegedly showing cowardice or desertion. And she travelled to the sites at which those executions took place and photographed them today, as they are today, at dawn, which was the time at which the executions took place. So that's quite a powerful way of sort of reflecting a particular aspect of the war. So that is kind of the main way in which we are commemorating the war through the collections. We also have a small display of items relating to the end of the war and the peace celebrations that took place in the city at the end of the war. You may know that the city has the War Memorial Park on the south side of the city, and that was created as a memorial to those who had died in the war. So we have a few items that commemorate the opening of the Memorial Park. So that's what we're doing in the display galleries, so that's what people can see when they come as part of their visit. But we also have a number of events going on as well. This coming Saturday we're having a family sort of activity day based around the theme of the First World War. And we're also showing the window, the production of the play The Window in the museum over several evenings, starting tonight and carrying on over the weekend. So there's quite a lot happening generally within the museum. In some ways it's kind of by chance really that we have stories in more detail relating to certain men. So some people have donated things to the museum or to the archives collection over the years that reflect either their own lives or the lives of their fathers and grandfathers and the role that they played during the war. So for example, we have quite a lot of medals in the collection that have been given to the museum over the years, some of which are from the First World War, and some of those have got quite good information attached to them in terms of what the person did. We've also got other objects, as I mentioned, like pieces of uniform, for instance, and again, sometimes that comes with information. The archives here contains a wealth of information about the First World War. I mean, there was a publication produced at the time called The Graphic, which was it was almost like a weekly newspaper, but had lots of pictures in. And around the period of the war, obviously a lot of their coverage was about what was happening either in Coventry or what Coventry men were doing on active service. So that's a good source of information. And sometimes we get things like letters, diaries. We have a very good collection of material relating to a guy called Walter Atkins, who was a gunner during the First World War and served with the 1st Tank Regiment. And his descendants have deposited a large body of material, including letters that he wrote from when he was away on active service to his mother back in Coventry. So we've got quite a lot of information about him. So it can be a bit hit and miss, but there are some people that we know quite a lot about. Well, to be honest, I think it is really important in Coventry, possibly more so in Coventry than in some other cities. As you're probably aware, I mean, Coventry has a very strong history of related to the Second World War and what happened to the city. We had the Blitz in 1940 and the destruction of the cathedral, and a lot of people associate Coventry very strongly with the Second World War, but I think the story of what Coventry did during the First World War is often overlooked. Coventry was a major centre of arms production. There were a lot of people who came to Coventry during that period to work here in factories. They were making all kinds of things, from shells to aeroplane engines. And Coventry did a huge amount to support the war effort. And I think that story has been somewhat forgotten or overshadowed by the Second World War. So I think it's important to tell that story and to just remind people about how important Coventry was. 35,000 soldiers, people from Coventry served in the armed forces, and I think somewhere around 2,500 of them were killed. So that's a lot of people from a city as the size that Coventry was at that time. That's quite a major figure in terms of the numbers of people who went. So it must have had a huge impact on the lives of everybody in the city at the time. I think probably everybody knew somebody who was affected by the war, either because their relatives were serving in the war, or perhaps they knew people who had been killed, or their friends and family were working in the armaments industry in some of the factories in Coventry. So I think the war must have affected pretty much everybody's lives, really. Before the war started, as you say, the motor industry was starting to grow and develop, but there were other industries as well, such as making machine tools and general engineering companies. So Coventry was really starting to grow quite a lot at that period, just before the war. There were lots of jobs in the city, lots of factories making things, and then when the war came along, I suppose it was relatively easy in some ways for lots of those factories to start making things for the war effort. So they made all kinds of things, guns, shells, aeroplane engines, vehicles, all kinds of things, and they were quite well set up, I think, to do that, and the engineering skills were already existed within the city. Lots of people worked in engineering, so the skills were already there. So I think it did transform the city in lots of ways. Coventry seems to have more or less picked up where it left off, I think, in terms of the industrial activity that was taking place in the city. Obviously there was a period of adapting back to moving back to the industries that they'd been focusing on before the war. Obviously there's no longer a need for all of the armaments production, for instance, so they could go back to what they were doing. And I think it seems to have adapted quite well to that. I think one of the biggest sort of changes, if you like, was that during the war lots of women had moved into the factories to take the place of the men who were away on active service, and they'd done a fantastic job to support the war effort, and it was a real opportunity, I think, in many ways. Although it was hard work for lots of women, it was an opportunity for them as well to get out of the home, to do jobs outside the home. It opened up new horizons for lots of women, and when the war ended, that suddenly stopped, and basically the women were told, thanks for your efforts, we don't need you anymore, the men are coming back to take their former jobs. So I think that was quite difficult for a lot of women, who'd had an experience of working and living their lives in a slightly different way, and having more freedom possibly, and then suddenly at the end of the war, that came to an end quite abruptly. I think because women had really stepped up and filled in and made such a huge effort to support the country's effort in the war. I think that absolutely, definitely helped to get the vote. Yeah.